Should we begin?
Yes, Mukta, both are working now. Can begin.
Aprajita, over to you.
Okay, all right. Good evening, everyone. This is the 143rd CPR CSH Urban Workshop, and it is an absolute delight to get Sunalini Kumar on board. She was previously a professor, not professor, I don't know what her title was in LSR, but that's where we first heard her talking about cities. And that's when I first thought about urbanization and issues around urbanity in a critical way. So today she is an associate professor at the School of Global Affairs in Ambedkar University in Delhi. She is educated in Delhi University, JNU and Cambridge. She's previously been a visiting fellow at Center for Studies in Developing Societies, Delhi, and a Fulbright scholar at MISAS, Columbia University. Sunalini's research interests are centered around urban and regional politics, gender and political theory, and the global South. Her publications are included in Critical Studies in Politics and Urbanizing Citizenship. And you all must have seen at least one of her writings on Kafila. Today, she's going to talk about a prehistory of the first master plan of post-colonial Delhi, enacted in 1962. She's bookending it through 3 years, 1939, 1949, and 1959. She is looking at the symbolic production of this document and the power it holds on the national capital territory. Over to you, Sunalini.
So thank you so much for the introduction, Aprajita, and thanks to CSH and CPR. I've been a groupie. I've been a follower of your very, very exciting talks, and I'm quite amazed to find that you've already done 140 odd talks. And so that is one of the longest running talk series that I'm aware of. I don't know about all of you. So it's really, in a way, like, being on the other side, and excited to see how it goes. So thank you to all of you who organized it. I think Mukta was involved, and Ms. Sharma and Maria Lynn, and everybody else who was who's involved in the series and for putting this together. I have in fact been meaning to sort of talk about this part of my research, and I really can't think of a better forum than this, a better platform than this. So with that, let me just get into my presentation. I just wanted to get a sense from the organizers of how much time I have to talk, so that we can also have a balance with the questions. And do we actually do, I mean, we have live questions and answers, or?
Yeah, we do. You have about
so 45 minutes, and we will take as many questions as we can after that. And this is deliberately no longer in the webinar format and has gone back to a regular Zoom meeting, so that we can, people can switch on their cameras and their audios and just talk.
Okay.
So
okay. Okay. So you said 45 minutes for the talk alone, or is it like?
Yeah. Yes, it would be nice. I think since we've started a few minutes late, maybe 40 to 45 would be.
I'll try and keep it to that. So thank you for and what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen now, and all of you know the title of my talk. Am I audible? Am I?
Yeah, you're fine.
Clear?
Yeah, you're absolutely clear. Yeah.
Thank you. So you know the title of my talk, and so I won't repeat that. But hopefully you will be able to see why a prehistory and why 3 chapters and so on and so forth. So let's go here. This is in full screen mode. Is it visible?
Yeah, it's all fine. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So, oops. Okay. So my talk actually has 2 provocations. It has 3 chapters, 2 provocations, 1 methodological clarification, and possibly a few concluding observations. So bear with me. Everything is an attempt to organize some rather messy and possibly preliminary material that I've been collecting over the years. Some of this was part of my doctoral work, but a lot of the thinking around the prehistory of the plan especially has changed significantly. And you might be able to see, I've actually mentioned that in one of my slides. And so I'm actually marking the fact that the way that I was looking at this material in my doctoral work and the way that I'm looking at it now is actually quite different, which I think happens to, the best of us. So with that kind of caveat, let me move forward. It's not so much a caveat as a kind of background for the way in which I think we can actually approach this issue. And that's why I have two provocations. I have some methodological clarifications. I have the 3 chapters themselves. And then as I said, if we have time, then I'll also look at, I do want to actually make some concluding observations. A lot of what I want to say might come up in the course of the talk itself, but I want to keep some time for concluding observations. So let's get into it. So my first provocation is that by the time the Delhi Master Plan came into being, right, by the time that it was published and released to the public in 1962, as is very well known, there was actually no city really left to plan. It's 1962. We're talking about a city that has been in almost continuous existence for millennia. But even if we leave that aside, what is it? The larger question that I really am raising, and this is a question again that exists in the planning literature. There is, there are entire sort of, entire journal issues that are, for instance, for the Town Planning Review or the International Journal of Planning History. If you just see some of the major urban planning journals, they will dedicate entire volumes to this whole question of, is there really any connection between the plan and the cities that develop, right? And of course, we ask that question in the context of Delhi as well. But in Delhi, it becomes especially urgent, I think. And that's the reason that I'm saying this in such a dramatic way, that there was in fact no city left to plan. The question that it really brings up for us when we look at the publication of the NPD in 1962, right? And it's been looked at, I don't need to say this to this audience, all of you have been studying this, I'm sure, from different angles. It's been looked at from different angles, right? What is the relationship of the planning establishment to the city? What is the relationship of the plan itself to the city? What constitutes the plan? What constitutes planning? And so on and so forth, right? So these are, of course, general questions to the rest of the world, but in Delhi, let's look at some of the specifics about why there is actually no city left to plan. And when I say there is no city left to plan, I mean that the processes of ordinary extent urban development are very much at the ripest when the planning team that actually came up with the NPD 62, when it is sitting down, with the drawing board and looking at it at a blank slate that is produced by this idea of expertise, right? When it is sitting there and doing this exercise in the 1950s, this is a ripe, mature urban city. It is particularly ripe because of certain historical factors, which I'll just lay out here. One of the things that I haven't mentioned here, and which all of you are really aware about, but I just want to flag it here, is that the most dramatic growth and development of the city actually has taken place in the previous decade. And when we say the growth and development of the city, we mean the kind of auto construction and the kind of building, the kind of frenetic building activity and settlement activity that we normally associate with urbanization has taken place in the previous decade. And it is one of the highest decadal rates of growth of urbanization that we have witnessed till date. And I don't simply mean, I don't mean only construction. I don't mean only the construction of built infrastructure, urban infrastructure, which was patchy at best in terms of government infrastructure. But if you look at, and again, this is quite well known, but I want to flag it in this context, which is if you look at decadal population growth, it is the highest that Delhi has ever had. The population growth that we have for the last census decade, right, which ends in 2011, is half of what we had in Delhi in the first decade. And even, the successive decades had some similar rates of growth, but it's never been as high as that. And everybody knows that's because of the influx of partition refugees and the frenetic claims that they were making on the city, the kind of negotiations between governments and refugees on those claims. And in the process, in that crucible, the city was getting built. So this is a highly built, highly dense, highly ripe, mature urban environment in a city. And this is a recent development in a city that has had a very long history of settlement. Okay. So what does it mean when the NPD is published and says that this is a plan for the orderly development of Delhi? Delhi is already developed. It's not orderly. It's not as orderly as the government would like. And of course, we know that this is also a decade in which there is a great obsession with order, which comes out of almost every government document that we see. There is the report, the Bharat Seva Samaj report on the slums of old Delhi. There's a great concern with hygiene. There's of course the concern with the great unwashed masses of the partition and so on and so forth. So it's the governmental discourse is of course built around order. And so Delhi is, far short of that order. It falls well short of that order, but it's a highly developed city. I mean, how much more can it develop? And so to get into some of the details of what development could mean in Delhi in 1961-62 when the NPD comes out, like I said, this is my initial provocation. There is not much city left to plan. And like I said, some of the specific historical reasons, if you go a little further back, so I've already spoken about the context of the 1950s, but if we go a little further back, 50 or 60 years back, let's go right to the end of the last century. When I say last century, it now means last to last century. So the 19th century, I apologize if some of this material is over familiar to some of you, but assuming that this is a general audience and not all of you are familiar, I'll just quickly run through this. So historians of Delhi know that this was in some ways Delhi has an extremely unique kind of position because of the arrival of the new capital in 1911. But even before the new capital and New Delhi was declared in 1911, you had this very strange situation where the old city of Delhi, right, which is Shahjahanabad, the walled city, it became sandwiched between. So there's already a pressure. You can see how the pressure, I mean, it's evident to anybody who studies Delhi, how Delhi is created out of a series of rather intense pressures, not created by the ordinary forces of urbanization, but created by rather by much larger forces, including the transnational occupying force of colonialism. So what happens with the old city towards the end of the 19th century is that it becomes sandwiched between two new capitals. There are quite few instances, to my mind, of this happening in such a dramatic way, where an old city, instead of being renewed and expanded, is sandwiched between two capitals. So you have a single city, which is rapidly decaying into a slum. That's a separate issue. But you have two new space-grabbing capitals. And the point to remember here, and this is a point that is studied so extensively by Delhi urban historians, far more than I can manage. And so I've drawn upon their work, and one of the people so two recent works that I'm thinking of are Raghav Kishore and Anish Vinayak. And especially Anish Vinayak's work, which I shall refer to also in the conclusion, because Vinayak's work actually helps us think quite provocatively and quite sort of creatively about what is happening in the post-independence period. He's talking about colonial Delhi, but it also some of that applies, but also can act as a kind of interlocution for what is happening post-Delhi. So I hope to return to Vinayak's work. But what Vinayak really is sort of pointing us to is how densely imbricated, right, local land and property relations were in the city of Delhi that made any kind of top-down planning almost impossible. And usually the way that we've actually understood this is to do with how colonial planning establishments are actually weak, right? And there is some truth to that, because especially as we see in the first of my 3 bookmarks in the 1939 era, one of the reasons that planning in Delhi starts to decline quite precipitously, even official efforts towards planning, which are at the best of times, they are patchy. One of the reasons that they begin to decline is because Britain starts to understand that a war is coming. it starts to understand that the nationalist agitation means that it is, so basically the investment in the kind of grand and grandiose urban expansion in India starts to fade. So it actually, urban planning in the colonial establishment in a formal sense, again, this is not an original point, but I'm flagging it here, has a rather kind of brief and short-lived kind of history. And so that's one of the reasons that Delhi does not really get, that it is not so easy for a rather weak planning establishment, which initially consists of members of the municipality, but then gets formally organized around organizations like the Delhi Improvement Trust. Why is it that they can't really intervene? There is such a denseness and such a materiality to the urban property land market, urban property land regimes, to just property relations and the property rights that various constituents have in the city, that planners are barely able to make a dent, right? And so you have this Shahjahanabad that is sandwiched between these two new ambitious, there's a temporary capital at civil lines, and then you have the new southern side for what we call New Delhi, Lachin's Delhi. But there are such intractable property conflicts that the government immediately gets into when it tries to actually move forward with building. The reason that, so civil lines, of course, is set up as a temporary capital in order to prepare for the new capital in New Delhi. The only way that the new capital is actually possible, civil lines itself is very difficult to acquire and settle. And again, historians have written about this. It's because civil lines has some parts of civil lines are easier because they belong to villagers. Land belongs to villagers, including some villagers that were actually defeated in the 1857 mutiny. So it's a kind of double benefit for the colonial government. They're able to take over their land, and they're able to punish these village populations, and also push some of these middle peasantry groups, including the Gujars, as is well known, outside the city limits, thereby also neutralizing a political threat. But within Shahjahanabad, okay, there's very little scope for expansion, partly because it's already a dense urban form. It's like a very densely settled urban form. Everybody knows this. But also because in the 1857 mutiny, one of the ways in which the government actually consolidated its political presence under the crown and staved off the threat of further mutinies, the story is that the British establishment was shocked out of its complacence. And so what they did was to buy off, apart from the famous stories of brutality and all of that repression that we've heard, but it also engaged in long-term buying off of powerful interests, converting a lot of the commercial elites around Delhi, right, the provincial commercial elites around Delhi, into landed aristocracy within the city of Shahjahanabad. Narayani Gupta, one of my favorite historians of Delhi, probably my favorite historian actually, calls them the lalacracy, right? And these were commercial elites, not necessarily of urban provenance, who were given big land grants in the middle of the old city and settled there, not only to reward them for their loyalty in the mutiny, but also to produce a native class of urban collaborators. They already had been doing similar kinds of things with rural collaborators, talking about the sturdy yeomen of Punjab and all of that. But this was a move to really, really establish their urban collaborators. And of course, in a city that was becoming increasingly important, even though it was not yet the capital. They were also given seats on the municipal committee, so their large properties were doubly protected. The only suburb outside of the walled city, Trevelyan-Ganj, was set up by a private profiteer, Charles Trevelyan. He was actually an official of the English East India Company, but he made his fortune as a profiteer. And he set up a suburb outside the walled city, and he profited from it, and it wasn't really it wasn't available for acquisition by the state. Even a small intervention, as Raghav Kishore's work has recently shown, in say shifting a bazaar, right? There was so much congestion around the Sabzi Mandi area, around the Nai Sadak area, and even tiny interventions in trying to shift a small portion of a commercial area. We're not talking about residential properties that were better protected, it met with an impossible snarl of objections from local interests, as well as from within the colonial state, because there were officials that were not in favor of these kinds of interventions. So these are these intractable land jurisdictions, right, that continue from so apart from the embroilments of post 1857 land grants and so on, you also have the older land jurisdictions from pre-British times, right, including Nazul and Waqf land. Some of them were restricted from the crown. They were also, but they were not all of them were easy to acquire. They also brought, so acquisition of Nazul lands, for instance, which had sort of echoes of, or rather, sort of taints of loyalty to the old Mughal Empire, brought a lot of communal tension and demands for rights uncomfortably close to the colonial establishment. So they tread very carefully. So they were always sort of goose-stepping around, not goose-stepping, pussyfooting. They were actually just basically avoiding getting into direct confrontations with community-owned land, right, which is what Waqf land is. But also Nazul land has the connotation of being usually owned by communities that have have received it as escheatment from the Mughal crown. So they also have that kind of very delicate and very tense kind of nature in terms of becoming identified with the community itself. There were also 500 odd villages in Delhi, and there were rural areas. Actually, it was only the rural areas that could be acquired. So again, it's well known, but it's important to place it in this context, that in that dense kind of fabric of land and property relations, the one kind of property that was least protected was rural property. This is a pattern that actually continues after independence. There's very little difference between the colonial and the post-colonial state on this, but the ways in which rural property comes to be acquired obviously has to be significantly different when there is a democratically elected government and there's a parliament and there's that kind of accountability. So that's a story that I will follow later. But for a while, at least, the 500 odd villages of Delhi were reasonably well protected by the various Punjab land alienation, because Delhi territory, which includes the rural areas, was part of the Punjab province at that time. And there was some very strong protections for agriculturists, if not for rural land per se, but for agriculture as a wanted, much wanted source of colonial revenue. Agriculture was a pampered, almost, like one can even use the word pampered, form of wealth creation for the colonial state. And Punjab was one of their strongholds in the north, in terms of the expectations they had from how Punjab would add to the colonial revenues. There was also the need to create a cantonment, because the military barracks and the glacis around the Red Fort had to be shifted after the mutiny. For a while, it became a kind of desolate space, and then finally land was found for the cantonment, roughly 10 acres in the beginning, and then there was more. So what Vinayak says, as I've already noted, is that there was a stupendous growth of private interests in the land and property markets pre-1947. Okay. And from the government side, we have a confirmation of this. Again, something I've mentioned, but I want to repeat here. From this work of Stephen Legg, we know, he's the one who uses, this work has been done by several scholars, but Legg actually uses a very, very helpful term, underbuilding, to actually describe the kind of decline of government commitment to the creation of public infrastructure, not just housing, but even basic infrastructure like roads and tram lines and electricity and so on and so forth, that we would expect, given the kind of pomp and show with which the new capital was announced in 1911. So Legg's argument is that through the 1920s and especially the 1930s, there is a precipitous decline in government commitment to expanding urban infrastructure in Delhi. And so we have two sides. We have one set of studies, one kind of research that is showing us how densely imbricated the government was in how tied it was, how tied its hands were in terms of being able to really expand its acquisition of urban property and to establish itself even spatially inside the territory of Delhi. But on the other hand, we also have confirmation that the official Delhi Improvement Trust was also the creation of the trust, which was also accompanied by a great amount of fanfare. It also did not make government a major player in the land market in Delhi. But this is the situation that we have until 1947. And obviously the question that comes up very urgently is that what happens post that. Now, the big exception, of course, to all of that has been said before, is New Delhi, right? The capital, you can see, I'm not going to read out the figures, you can see that the capital was built while there was very little land to be acquired to improve the old city, or even to expand the temporary capital and civil lines. There was enormous tracts of land that were rural land that was acquired for the establishment of the new capital south of the old city, so the southern side as it's called, right? And so the most of that land was from rural owners. In fact, I don't know about 20,000 acres, almost 21,000 acres were acquired. We do have records for approximately 17,000 acres, and it would be safe to assume that the remaining 3 or 4 acres were basically rural land that were acquired. It could include some amount of Nazul land, but I don't have evidence to actually say that. But in any case, it's a dramatic figure, 17,000 acres, as opposed to just look at the measly acres that were used for improving the old city or to create small extensions in the old quarters. So you have this massive new city just coming up right alongside a decaying, now a quite rapidly decaying old city. Villages including Raisina and Malcha, not very far from where the offices of CPR and CSH are, and so I mean Lutyens Delhi basically. So you have this, and the interesting thing is that unlike some of the developments that happened later on, where the government evolved these methods to actually not take away the residential land of villagers and created this whole Lal Dora system. At this time, the removal of the villagers was absolutely complete. Right, so there were no urban villages that were left within these 17,000 acres. They were completely wiped out, and they had to move to areas as far as Sonipat in Haryana. The second provocation is that there's also no capital left to plan. So one thing that some people have argued, and it's a fair argument, is that if the MPD 62 was not really about planning a city, it was at least about planning and consolidating a capital. And of course, this is a kind of this is a line of questioning that I was also really intrigued by for many years, so at least a couple of years, where I was thinking that Delhi's value was not so much in terms of it performing the ordinary roles of a city, because in many ways Delhi is an atypical city, right? And we all know this, that there's hardly any there's hardly any industrial activity compared to traditional cities of even India. Even in colonial modernity in India, you have far more spectacular industrialization and the concomitant sort of appearance of urban features in so many cities. Even cities like Kanpur and Ahmedabad do much better than Delhi in terms of conforming to the kind of typical patterns of urbanization. So in many ways, Delhi is an atypical city, of course, but everybody understands that, especially after we had Peter Hall's classification of different kinds of cities and different kinds of capitals, we think of Delhi as a symbolic and monumental capital. We think of it as a political capital, and there is a category of cities like that perform very large symbolic role for the nation, right, as the capital of the nation. But the thing is that if you look at Delhi, I'm not sure that there was even a capital left to plan. And that was, the obvious reason is something that you would already know. I'll just come to that. But before we do that, I would really like us to look at this quote by Lawrence J. Vail, who has a very well-known book, a 2008 book on capital cities and the kinds of capital cities that we have in the world. And it's a very helpful typology. He draws on Peter Hall's typology, but he kind of takes it further. And one thing that makes his typology is relevant for us is that he's particularly interested in the kind of politics and structures, sort of both aesthetic, visual, but also political structures, political symbolism that is created in post-colonial capitals. So he says that let's just consider one of his typologies. He says, as far as post-colonial states are concerned, they have two kinds of situations happening. They either plan new parliamentary complexes in the 20th century in, so he's given examples of Australia, Turkey, Brazil, Pakistan, Belize, etc., etc. Or they have created a parliamentary complex adjacent to the existing capital, right? So there are examples that he's given of that as well: Israel, Bangladesh, Papua New Guinea, etc., Sri Lanka. Now, the interesting thing is that Delhi does not fall into either of these two categories, because we did not have a new capital in 1947. We did not create a new capital. It's an ancient city, densely settled. There's a new city that was created, a new capital that was created in 1911. The building of the new capital finishes only as recently as the 1930s, even though it's a very kind of, the most spectacular elements of New Delhi were completed quite well and quite effectively and without any doubt. But the more pedestrian elements, right? Housing for clerical staff of the government, for instance, it got embroiled in all of those urban land contradictions that I've been mentioning. And some of it succumbed to the logic of underbuilding. And while all of these processes were petering out, it was already the 1930s. And the Nehru government assumes power in 1947. It is just too recent to create a brand new capital. So, this is just a side note. It is not surprising that Nehru invested so much emotional energy, so much political energy, of course, but also it looks like the way that the stories are told, so much personal investment in the creation of Chandigarh, because that was one of those sites where that kind of novelty and the pristine symbolic power and grandeur of the new capital of Punjab in this case could be actually performed. So Chandigarh is far more typical of what Vail is talking about in terms of post-colonial capitals than Delhi. So we come back to Delhi and we come back to the peculiarity of this situation where you have two capitals and one slum, which is what we've inherited from the colonial apparatus. Civil lines, of course, becomes a private, rather kind of posh private enclave, and has till date remained something of an enclave on the north border of the old city, right? It's quite spatially, it's quite distinct from the old city. And as I just said, you have the new capital, which is very, very recently completed. So if all of this is true, I'm just going to look at my time here. If all of this is true, then we have two choices, right? Then we can think of the MPD 62 as simply an elaborate fiction. And that in itself is quite interesting to study. It's the kind of project that many who do study urban planning have done very profitably and gained a lot from it. So you can say that it's an elaborate fiction. You can even find evidence for it. You can say that we think of it as a sort of, if not a complete fiction, you can say it's a very weak and ineffective planning instrument. It just set down a set of orthodoxies that nobody really followed. You have zoning, central business districts, this whole polynodal, polycentric structure, which has been lampooned in some of the literature, at least. Especially, it's quite amazing. There's something that I've spoken about in some other, or written about in other places, in one other place at least, which is that, in India, it's amazing that planners themselves, mount the most damning of critiques of previous plans. So, in fact, it's almost as if the MPD is only narrated as a series of failures. There's this discourse of failure is really prominent in the way that we talk about the MPD, not just the 62 one, but also the successive ones. And, there's some truth in it. Some of these very, very significant pillars on which the MPD was built, right? Zoning, central business, all of these, right? The curiously soulless district centers, the proposal for ring towns that never materialized. This is quite dramatic, of course, because Najafgarh and Vallabhgarh were meant to be great growth centers. Gurgaon was meant to be nothing, because the planners went to Gurgaon and concluded that because there is a water shortage, it's never going to be a viable city. So all of these spectacular failures are well known and widely discussed. And if one follows this line of inquiry, we can also look elsewhere for the real drivers of urbanization. You can look at local politics and capital, you can, and PELF, and, you know, who actually has clout, even very high quality journalistic accounts like Rana Dasgupta's book Capital has done that, as far as the southwest of Delhi is concerned, and the farmhouses and all of that. So you can do that. You can look at where the power really resides, who's actually moving and shaking the city, of course, and that's, like I said, it's a profitable line of inquiry. You can also look at private capital, something that I myself have done when I followed the career of the DLF in a kind of later, in a later phase. You can look at central land acquisition legislation, right, which kind of brings me to the to one of the two archives that I actually ended up looking at, because land acquisition is a very important part right from the establishment of the colonial capital to even the repeated invocation of the Delhi Land Acquisition Act in the post-independence era, as is again known to most of you. Master plans in India have the power of the state behind them. They, you know, also the Delhi plan was meant to be exemplary. So there was a real central legislative power behind it, and the eminent domain that was conferred by the 1894 Land Acquisition Act was used repeatedly. The sections 4 and 6 of the act were continuously invoked to acquire land for various purposes in and around Delhi. Whether those purposes created a city or whether those purposes froze land in order to make that land available for long-term speculative accumulation is, of course, a very big question. And that's a question that's, I mean, that would be one of my concluding observations, but since I've already mentioned it. There's another choice if you're looking at the MPD, which is to, and again, an equally fascinating line of inquiry, which is to look at who makes the plans and what the context of the plans are, and to kind of read the plans against the grain. So you can place plans in context, and then you can just sort of look at each of the provisions of the MPD 62 and just kind of, you know, push it against the grain and just kind of see what comes up there. And so, you know, this is also something that I've done, and I, for a while, you know, this was the primary kind of research that I was doing, which is that, so it'll take us to Cold War American interventionism, what Matthew Connolly says about, you know, the honing of certain surveillance techniques in the Second World War and the using of those techniques in community development programs. And, you know, he has amazing work about population and about lots of other things as well. It applies really, really quite closely and uncomfortably to the Delhi Master Plan. It looks at, I mean, we can also start in a less sort of sinister vein. We can also look at just the incredible circulation of transnational planning expertise. Stephen Ward talks about it. Vera Rezende has an article, a really useful article on this. The sharing of developmental political imaginaries between post-colonial elites and, you know, middle-class professionals from the global north. So you have a very strange kind of alliance forming here between somebody who's at the level of Nehru and somebody who's at the level of Albert Mayer, who's just an ordinary middle-class engineer. Even some of the more celebrated town planners of which were invited by the Ford Foundation were, you know, sort of professional architects and not really equipped to handle the kind of, even those associated with the RPAA, the Regional Planning Association of America, the New York Regional Plan, they were just ordinary architects. They weren't really equipped to deal with the kind of scale that they encountered in creating a regional plan for Delhi. Actually, the MPD is a regional plan. It's not just a city plan. So on paper, it's a very ambitious plan. So like I said, these are the lines of reasoning that I had taken for years myself, especially occupied by the idea of post-war expertise. But I was still interested in how Delhi grew and changed. And I was still interested in what happened before the plan, because I was continuously finding clues that they were planning, that the Delhi Master Plan arrived onto a landscape that was already, you know, deeply contested. Because you can see echoes of that in the work studies that accompany not in the master plan itself, but there is this much more detailed volume called the work studies. And you can see some of the debates and the agonies and the conflicts and the self-questioning and all of that happening in the work studies. And you see sort of traces or echoes of what may have transpired earlier. So I became very interested in the decade before the master plan was published. One archive that I looked at briefly, but it requires a lot more work, is judicial decisions on land and property related cases. So I did find two particularly rich archives, which actually showed me how Delhi was planned before the plan. And one was these land and property related cases in the Delhi High Court, also in the Supreme Court, because that's located in Delhi. There were at least 6,000 objections which were filed between 59 and 61, just the 2 years before the plan. That was a time that was given to the petitioners to, and there's an enormous amount of material that those cases reveal on all of those social, political, economic forces that were shaping the city in the 1950s. But like I said, that's a much harder archive to actually trawl through. It's a massive archive, and it wasn't extending far enough back for my purposes. So I started looking at parliamentary debate, and specifically at Lok Sabha debates between 1949 and 1959. So these two are two of my latter bookmarks, right? But I also have 1939, so I'll explain why 1939 also became important in the story. So there were two Lok Sabha, so there were two bookmarks from the Lok Sabha debates, there's 49 and there's 59. And I started looking at all of the debates happening in Parliament on the question of Delhi and related issues in this period. And I zeroed in on a few of the most important bills and discussions. The discussion on the DDA, on setting up of the Delhi Developmental Authority, which was the successor to the Delhi Improvement Trust. And these were debates that took place in 1957. Then I also, the interesting thing is that I found material in places that weren't about the urban at all, but enormously impacted how urban Delhi would have been shaped. And these were to do with debates on how rural land in Delhi was to be treated. And they had some direct connections to what was happening when the new capital was acquired. So even though everything is already planned, everything is already developed, there's a massive amount of auto construction taking place by partition refugees. Cities like Faridabad, Nilokari have come up literally out of thin air because of the scale, because of the sheer pace of building activity that is happening by ordinary citizens. And this is how the city actually expands, right? The city is expanding not because the DDA comes up in 1957 and undertakes an ambitious public infrastructure building program. The DDA is very much like the DIT. It's very much, if you look at its long history, in terms of any kind of publicly available services, if you're not talking about land acquisition, if you're talking about the provision of urban services, it is very much an underbuilder. And it's a speculator and it's a hoarder as far as its long-term record is concerned. Shipra Maitra has a very good analysis of the record of DDA's production of housing. So housing, of course, gets overtaken by the private sector. Working class housing that was supposed to be built by the DDA goes off into middle class housing, for instance, in the Indraprastha estate, where a lot of us academics have taken places, Trans Yamuna, and so on and so forth. So the DDA is not the driver of really building Delhi. It is ordinary citizens. And there's a lot of sort of sweat labor that is, even as a philosophy, that is very popular at this time. You can see Nehru actually saying to the refugees who are protesting around outside Teen Murti Bhavan that they need to go away and build their own houses, right? And that they will be punished if they unionize and organize themselves and so on. So it's very harsh. There's a kind of sweat labor kind of philosophy that is animating auto construction here. And it's also desperation because people are in the city and they need to live here. So it's not the government that's really accommodating them. But the government is interested in establishing itself as one of the players in the very hectic land market that emerges in Delhi. And what it does is to first try to intervene in the urban land market, right? It gets its fingers burnt by understanding exactly like the colonial state did in the pre-47 era, how difficult it is to prove legally claims on land unless you use eminent domain. And eminent domain is something that they never can politically afford to use as far as urban property owners are concerned. And here I want to make a point that became quite apparent to me while I was looking at this material, which is that we normally think of politics in India as having, I mean, there are people like Ashish Nandi, for instance, in a very different context, who've made this argument that Indian politics has a rural bias. And to my mind, as if you're looking at the kind of early post-colonial state building that is taking place, early acts, early Lok Sabha debates, as I was looking at, it's very clearly, and I know that it's a very limited, it's a limited archive. I'm also only looking at Delhi, and Delhi is a very special case, but it is so obvious that the government there are two things that become very obvious. One, that Delhi has enormous symbolic political value. Again, it's not surprising. It's the capital of the post-colonial fledgling republic and all of that. But the government knows for a fact that it cannot alienate urban landowners in the city. And so it continues to protect them directly or indirectly in multiple ways when it is passing these acts. And I'll give some concrete examples later. The second thing is that the government knows that if it does not immediately engage in credible looking land acquisition and land development activity, not just locally but nationally, and that's a project that is undertaken by the 5-year plans, which is actually temporal planning, not spatial planning, but both in terms of local spatial planning and long-term national temporal planning, the government has to establish itself as a credible landowner, as a credible landlord. And it might sound like obvious to say this, but it's not easy at all for the government to actually establish its claim as a credible landlord. And you see the range of arguments and, justifications, and sometimes also very awkward entanglements that the government gets into while actually simultaneously trying to assert its rights as an ordinary landowner. Since we are come to the end of the of time, I'm not going to spend so much time on the 1949 and 1959, but so let me just say, so in 1949, the government starts discussions in the Indian Parliament on what is the first of a series of acts. The latest amendment to the latest act, actually the 1971 Public Premises Act, happened just now in 2019. And it was very widely reported in the newspapers because it was this version, this iteration of this amendment of the act was actually aimed at getting MPs to clear out government bungalows. So the act is called the Public Premises Eviction of Unauthorized Occupants Act, and very recently it was used to evict MPs who, as we know, continue to stay in the Lutyens bungalow zone. It's like an old hoary tradition in Indian politics that MPs don't vacate once their term is over. So the most recent amendment to the act was actually used to to make these MPs leave. But the first time the act was used in 1949 was to actually evict partition refugees from the government buildings that they had occupied. Not just government buildings, but also government land, including monuments like Purana Killa, where there was a massive presence of a massive camp, which the government later regularized, of again, initially auto-constructed by partition refugees. So the Public Premises Eviction of Unauthorized Occupants Act of 1949, it brought up the government against all of the other significant property and land interests in the city of Delhi, including ordinary squatters. And here, that's why I'm going to go back to the point about the urban bias. From what I have observed in the case of Delhi, and this is obviously needs to be corroborated by work on other Indian cities, but what I have observed in terms of what I'm calling the urban bias is that even subaltern and marginal sections of the urban population, for instance, Dalit communities. Prajita, are you going to ask me to wrap up?
Sort of, yeah. Just as in, how long do you need? I mean, they're all excellent points. I don't want to stop you, but then
No,
also
no.
like,
Excellent or not, I'll take 5 more minutes.
okay,
Yeah.
all right, great. Okay.
Okay. So even non-elite, non-privileged sections of the urban claimants to property, and squatting is one of the most flimsy claims to property, right? It can go anyway, as we know, have been favored over rural landowners as far as Delhi is concerned, even well off and relatively affluent sections of the rural landowning gentry. So you see this in two very significant acts. You see the impossibility of government actually. So you see it again from two sides. In 1949, the government is not able to establish clearly its claims as landowner. Every time it is faced with a legal case in which it is representing itself as an ordinary landowner, all of the contradictions of its actions are very clearly evident to not just the petitioners and the defendants and the other parties involved in the case, but all of its detractors in parliament, including members of the Congress party that are not happy with the bill that is being introduced by the Housing and Works Minister at that time. So the government is getting into really, really terrible embroilments. It's not able to defend its claim as an ordinary landowner. And of course, in the next decade, it takes more and more recourse to other instruments in order to mop up land for Delhi. It is deeply invested in mopping up any land in Delhi that it can, but there is very little land left to be mopped up. Plus, its legal claims as landowner are not standing in a court of law. And it also has a political commitment because of the partition to protect even the most marginal, in fact, especially possibly the most marginal sets of urban property claimants, like squatters. So that's 1949. So I'll maybe go forward and then go back and finish with 1939. 1959, we see the passing of the amendment to the Delhi Land Reforms Act, which is first passed in 1954. And I don't have time to present the evidence, but I can always share my paper. It was an act, the 1954 Act, following from the Congress's Agrarian Reforms Committee in 1949, also in 1949, but also much more importantly, the failure of land reform through the 1950s in other states. The 1954 Delhi Land Reforms Act became an opportunity for the Congress government to show how successful its land reform program was. And it did that by completely dispossessing Delhi villagers. And it did that in ways that were not, again, standing up to the scrutiny in parliament, but it just rammed through with it. And it became a matter of not just sponging up wasteland or excess land or fallow land. They imposed very, very strict conditions on what kind of agriculture was allowed by the state. And anybody who failed those conditions, any farmer who failed those conditions would have their land escheated to the government. But that wasn't enough. What they had to come back and do in 1959 was to make significant exemptions that allowed urban property owners, which then one of them became Delhi Lease and Finance, later on DLF, allowed urban property owners to acquire rural land at rural land prices. So after they had sponged up land and made it urban, they made it rural again so that urban property owners, individual private landed interests, could actually acquire it at cheaper rates. In this way, one of the things Vinayak says about the pre-independence period is that the state, in fact, ingested the private property market. I would put it actually, for me, the emphasis is exactly the opposite. To me, the private property market almost ingested the state at this time. Jumping back to 1939, there was this remarkable thing that happened in 1939. I'll just leave it there and then maybe we can, if there are questions, I can explain what I mean. 1911, the new capital was established as, with all of that pomp and splendor and all of that grandiosity. And because there's been so much emphasis on the grandiosity and the monumentalism of New Delhi, it is often forgotten that it actually never became a full city. And the reason it didn't become a full city was not because it wasn't planned as such, but between 1911 and 1939, apart from the underbuilding that I'm talking about, that actually affected Old Delhi and civil lines and the new suburban areas more, what happened was that the government basically decided to freeze the development of New Delhi as an enclave of a new thing that they invented in 1939 in the New Delhi Development Committee report called Greater Delhi. There was no imagination of a Greater Delhi until then. It suddenly came up in a 1939 report. And once it came up, it acquired a logic of its own. You have the 1955 Interim General Plan also talking about Greater Delhi. And by this time, the forces of regionalization, which are actually one of the features of the MPD that are consistent and stubborn and actually very successful, is regionalization and large-scale land acquisition for regionalization, with the what I would call unpardonable protection of the core of Central Delhi or NDMC or Lachin's Bungalow zone, because the ordinary strains of urbanization have not been allowed to enter the city. So it's what I call enclave urbanism. I can say more about it, but the most remarkable feature of 1939 as a bookmark, as far as the development of long-term development of Delhi is concerned, is that an obscure government report suddenly sanctioned or unleashed a series of forces that has led to what we see as the NCR today. It was never part of the original plans. The report tried to argue that it was the intention all along. I mean, it's interesting that plans can have intentions like people that are not expressed on paper. What we have right now is it started off a series of forces that have actually not far more than the MPD created the NCR that we know today. Okay. So these are my preliminary observations. I'll just leave them on the screen. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. This is
I'm
great.
done.
There's so much to think about. I mean, I've been taking notes. So this is, I'm not even going to talk about my questions because that'll take away from everything.
We'll meet separately for that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to jump right in with Sanjay Srivastav, Professor Srivastav.
Sunalini, do you want to stop share so that we can see people? And
so I think this I've actually
Sanjay
spoken
is
about,
here.
so I don't need to.
You can ask his question. Sanjay, if you're here, you can ask or unmute yourself and ask your.
Can he unmute himself, or should I do that for him?
I think he should be able to.
Okay. Everyone else, you can you please feel free to leave your questions or raise your hands. I can see one.
See Sanjay's question in the.
Yeah. I don't know why. I do see him here.
So unmute him. Maybe he can't unmute himself. Oh, his microphone's not working. Okay. And then Prajita, maybe you can read it out.
Okay, so I'm just going to read it out. He was surprised to hear that the colonial government was not a major player in the land market. Once the Delhi Improvement Trust is established and almost all of Delhi declared Nazul crown land, almost no land can be bought or sold except by the state. DDA takes over this aspect after 1957. This was also at the heart of, say, the proliferation of unauthorized colonies of inland, which are a result of the artificial inflation of land prices when the state becomes a land speculator. It is also linked to private urbanization in Noida and Gurgaon. So do you want to elaborate?
Shall I respond or?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. That's actually very helpful for me to clarify something which may not have come across clearly. I'm talking about land that is not constructed. So sorry, you're talking about Nazul land is land that is not constructed. I was talking about land that had any amount of construction on it. So the Nazul was the one category of land, and I think that people have written on this, but I'm just going to venture something here. It was the one category of land that, because of the waning power of the Mughal Empire and then the Muslim communities that are dependent on the Mughal Empire, becomes available for the DIT in this way. But anything that is already claimed by a whole host of urban property owners, speculators, the entire commercial market in land that is already established, that Vinayak actually talks about and puts in great detail, that's not available. So the point is not to say that the government was not a major player in an absolute sense. Of course, it's a major player. It has to keep itself relevant in the urban land market. What I find, and I think following from Vinayak, I agree, what I find surprising is how little power it has in the face of organized urban property interests, even slightly minor ones. So you have even local cooperatives. Actually, the DIT does win a case against a local cooperative. This is it is a weak urban property claimant, which is cooperative housing societies. So when I give an example of how ordinary citizens who call themselves ordinary citizens and come up and form a CHG, a cooperating housing group, they actually finally, after a very protracted battle, they lose rights to the land that they had claimed to the DIT. The DIT, of course, doesn't build on it for a while. But what's amazing is that they actually have they express their anger openly in the newspapers. They take out like advertisements that are there in the archives that actually accuse the DIT of profiteering, of speculation, and this and that. I guess what I'm placing this in contrast to when I say that the colonial government is not a major player in the land market, is not just in contrast to what I just said, which is the other urban property players, but its own claims at the foundation of New Delhi, that it has, so the impression that we have is that it has acquired this virgin land, right? And it is free to build on it. But it obscures the fact that it is embroiled in these other intractable negotiations in both in civil lines and in the old city. And all of the suburban development that takes place outside of LBZ after 1947, it finds itself in the same contradictions. So to me, the constraintness is actually surprising in the face of its own claims, in the face of its wish or fantasy to be a sovereign landowner.
Well, he has another comment. I think we'll just take it before the question. Sorry, people who have questions, we'll get to you. The state was pretty much the only player in Delhi from 1937 onwards. Only DLF develops colonies till 1957, and then DDA prohibits almost all private land development. Anyway, this requires a longer discussion. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to take that forward, or
I just want to know if you want to say one more thing about what it means to be the only player from 1937 onwards, right? From 1937 to 1957, you have the construction of a very small
land monopolist.
From 37 to 57, yes. From 37 to 57, yes. But by that time, most of the events that I'm talking about have already taken place. 37 to 57, there is again a very, very one is, of course, the war arrives. So that is being used as an excuse by the colonial government to not actually put up, not invest. In fact, the British have begun to actually roll out of urban planning altogether. So the state being a major player, I agree with you, but it doesn't really mean much in terms of construction on the ground. By the time 1937 rolls around, they've already seen how constrained they are in terms of how limited they are in terms of what the other powerful urban property claimants are. So I was just wondering if you had any response to the way in which Vinayak sets out the material on this. But I agree with you that 37 to 57, they were a monopolist and they built very little. And the reason that they passed the 1959 Act was to retrospectively make DLF's agricultural land acquisition that later leads to the colonies of South Delhi, that produces super profits for them, and then allows them to actually move into Gurgaon to actually sanction that. The 1959 amendment sanctions the acquisition of land post the 1954 land reforms. So in terms of comparison, I mean, to me, officially, yes, the state produces a discourse about itself being authoritative on land, but the number of exemptions and the number of embroilments in private urban property ownership that it engages with. It also actually, like I said, the 1959 for me is a moment where there is a sanctioning of, depending on how you put it, either the state ingesting the private property market or the private property market ingesting the state. But there's basically a fusion. You can see it in the parliamentary debates. That's what they're being accused of, that they are favoring private landowners. And the kind of super profit that DLF made in South Extension, in Okhla, in Greater Kailash,
Kalkaji,
Kalkaji, Green Park, that allowed them to actually, and they got further exemptions in the Alkra in 1976, which actually allowed them to take all their profit and move to Gurgaon. So I'm not sure that, but yeah, technically they were a land monopolist.
Sorry, can you hear me? I'm able to now.
Yeah.
No, I won't say anything more. I just want to say, actually, DLF was bankrupt between 57 and 81. It bought land in Gurgaon, not from the money it made in Delhi, but through credit schemes. It bought land from caste affiliations.
It made a massive amount of land I agree with you, but I also want to add that KP Singh has written about the amount of money he made because of a change in a building regulation involving a thing called an ad measure. He created this thing called ad measuring, and that allowed him to bypass the Alkra and retain a huge amount of urban property that should have been mopped up by, yes, they were bankrupt as a finance company in 1957 to 1981, but the kind of profits they had made in land, they were, and the kind of monopolies that they had in land in these building colonies, they were able to protect those monopolies through something called ad measuring. And Singh actually talks about it. So they did have a credit scheme, and that was, so as a finance company, they revived themselves in the 1980s, but they never really lost anything on their real estate.
Okay, I think well, this is great. I'm gonna
I have to think more about. Okay, yeah.
We'll just have to move on to the other two people who have been waiting very patiently. I don't know who raised their hands first. I'm just gonna go with Rachna first, and then Sahil. You, Rachna.
Thanks, Aprajita, and thanks, Sunalini, for that talk. So I have 2 points, Sunalini. Firstly, regarding the ring towns, which you call fact or fiction. And I'm just thinking, because if you look at the Delhi Master Plan, 1962, it actually, the significance of the master plan, as you also pointed out, is how to streamline the growth of not only Delhi, but also in the larger context of regional planning. And I don't know if I would call it a fiction, because the ring towns, whether it was Loni, Ghaziabad, especially Faridabad, Ballavkar, Gurgaon or Punjab and Narela, they were supposed to actually serve as these counter magnets to the capital city to accommodate the surplus migrant population. One, of course, if you look at Faridabad, that's because they have to settle all the refugee migrants who come in. And so you do point out with the fact that it is there, it is happening to create the stable employment opportunities and to also remove the excess demographic growth of Delhi. So I wouldn't call it a fiction, because these ring towns are very much tied to their growth is very much tied to the master plan of Delhi. And so there is, I mean, for me, I would really think through that, why would you call it a fiction? Secondly, what you said about, I would be more cautious when you say about auto construction of these towns, of these houses by the refugee. Now, auto construction would largely mean that it was without any help and without any aid by the government. And I agree that the refugees were demanding from Nehru that they should be settled well. But at the end of the day, if you look at Faridabad itself, the creation is through the Faridabad Development Board. Nehru was very much instrumental in the meetings of this board. Then there is a rehabilitation program under which housing is coming to place. There are ideas which are coming from Ford Foundation and others, and planning is through Otto H. Koenigsberger and other people. So to call it entirely as auto construction would be taking away that credit, which actually the state should also be given, the way these refugee towns which came in Nilokheri, you mentioned, and others, they actually came up with the state. Of course, the refugees were used to build up these towns, but that wouldn't have been possible if cooperative societies, which were started by Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay and others, wouldn't have intervened. So I would be a little cautious by using that word, that they were entirely done because the refugees were the one who were responsible. in building the town. The state was very much there and instrumental in helping. Thank you.
Okay, I want to respond because I think that I did say at the end of the talk that regionalization is one of the features of the MPD that actually succeeds wildly even beyond what the MPD has imagined. So I'm not calling that a fiction. I was saying that we have a choice to look at the MPD entirely as a fiction. And if I wasn't clear in how I expressed it before, I want to say very clearly that we cannot actually credibly call the MPD a fiction because there are certain portions of the MPD that not only succeeded, but went wildly beyond the imagination of even the planners. And in this context, I was saying, there is something that I call non-official regionalization that actually took the dynamics of the regional plan for MPD outside the plan. I mean, it actually comes from slightly independent sources. So let me just explain. If you look at the two most successful suburban developments in outside Delhi, it is Noida and Gurgaon, right? It is not Loni, it is not Balabgarh, it is not even Faridabad, although Faridabad had great potential. So it is Noida and Gurgaon that are seen as the most successful suburbs of Delhi. They were not there in the MPD. So I'm saying that it's a kind of ironic twist. I mean, it's kind of it's an interesting twist on what the MPD said. There was Noida was not even a twinkle in the eye of the MPD planners, and Gurgaon was actually invoked only in order to talk about its unsuitability for any kind of suburban development. Loni was considered a very important site. Balabgarh was considered a very important site. And neither of them actually developed in the way that the MPD envisaged. But I did say that regionalization is one of the features of the MPD that actually succeeds. It succeeds in a very different form from the plan, but it succeeds spectacularly. I mean, the NCR is one of the largest agglomerations in the world. The second thing about the auto construction, there was a very distinct hierarchy between the kind of colonies that were available within Delhi limits for the refugees. So you have, Lajpat Nagar, you have, I can't think of the other names, but you have the very iconic sort of post 1947 colonies, which had a significant amount of government intervention. And yes, the government was involved in the plans for Nilokri and Faridabad. But what happens with Nilokri and Faridabad, and especially with Faridabad that I do have more details for, is that it very rapidly becomes the responsibility of the refugees. And I think auto construction is a term that is justified here. And even sweat labor is a term that is justified here, because how is the Nehru government, how on earth is it able to kind of sanction this kind of separation between the way in which New Delhi is built, the way in which New Delhi is being protected, the way in which refugee colonies inside Delhi are being protected, and Nehru asking the refugees who are not trained in construction to actually construct their own houses in Faridabad. So the governing apparatuses, the Faridabad Development Board, and the imagination for Faridabad to actually absorb the refugees, all that is there. And there is an initial amount of support as well in terms of capital, but the labor comes from the refugees themselves. And I found this quite remarkable.
No, so I meant self-built houses, but auto construction means when it's entirely done by people themselves.
Oh, okay. You're saying that, you're saying that
Yeah.
technically the way that, the term is used in urban literature, it means that construction that is completely outside the state. So yes, so to that extent, I take your point. But I just
want to intervene here and say that the Govind Vallabh Pant papers and Meherchand Khanna papers and Nehru papers all mention this entire period and precisely this question of infrastructure, who's going to build for the refugees, sort of avoiding who's going to bring in the cement, who's going to be actual architects on ground. And Lajpat Nagar comes up as a sort of a model for like, let's build like Lajpat Nagar, let's build like them. And so yes,
and this model of self-help, charity, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and all these self-help groups, Seva.
Those papers are very important
that animate, the refugee townships.
There's anyone interested.
There's no official PWD labor that is made available for them, from what I know.
But PW itself was in a bit of a transition, right? At that time,
PWD was
the state itself. So the state itself was like, what is state at that point? Okay, who is next?
So Sahil seems to have disappeared. Is Sahil here? And Manas?
No, Sahil. I heard Sahil. No? Okay, Manas then.
Yeah, I'm right here, but
Sahil, sorry.
Sahil's here, and then Manas had a question and he put it in the chat. I mean, he's
Sorry.
stated in the chat that he has a question.
Yeah, I just lowered my hand just to avoid the confusion, but I guess that was not a good idea. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Hi, Sunalini. Thanks for the presentation. It's really helpful. I myself am a PhD student at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the geography department, and I'm actually looking at similar questions on thinking about two of your interests, about thinking about how property or the transition from land to property has become central to even contemporary urbanization in Delhi, and the way we think about the new shifts that are happening from land acquisition to land pooling, or thinking about farmhouses to low density residential areas, thinking about cooperative housing to now essentially property. There's no affordable land, there's only affordable housing. And so, there's this land to property shift. And the second aspect that I think is also very interesting and something that I'm interested in is about what you talk about, this urban bias, and how rural land is always at the end of the spectrum. The last concern in the city is what happens to the villagers and their claims on land. And surprisingly, especially in land pooling, that is changing now, because everyone knows villages are not holding most of those lands. And so at some level, I'm just interested in thinking about how do you see the trends that you're observing in this prehistory of the 62 master plan kind of playing out in the contemporary sphere of Delhi's neoliberal post-colonial shifts, and I'm just saying if you see any parallels, and definitely there would be more that I'd like to talk to you separately. Sorry, I'm just going to take that, but I'm going to be hearing you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the question, because I actually did have a couple of points about the draft plan for Delhi 2041. And it's always nice to do this comparison and to see what parts of the MPD, I mean very technically, just in terms of like the articles of faith of the MPD, like what parts remain and what parts have, apart from what the extent development is, but what parts of the plan remain within the planning establishment and what have been dropped as a concession to these new developments. So I would agree with you that there is a real rethinking going on FAR and mixed use and all of that. Zoning is more or less dropped as an article of faith. It is not something that I don't think it's going to come back. I hadn't thought about the shift from land to property, but it's very helpful. So I'll keep that in mind. And of course, we can talk more about it. Mixed land use is being sanctioned. There is one stubborn feature, which is that industry is still not encouraged, and whatever industry will be encouraged will be clean industry. So now we have this kind of catch-all term called clean industry. So I just, in terms of the rural, I think the decimation of the rural is more or less complete within Delhi. The last remainder of the rural in Delhi was this almost this caricature of the Lal Dora, right? The Lal Dora land. And the Lal Dora land is not going to, I mean, the villagers themselves want the Lal Dora to go. They've been petitioning all governments, starting from the Sheila Dikshit government. And it looks like it's finally going to be repealed, this protection for the Lal Dora. And they're all, again, giving this is what is interesting. Govind Ballabh Pant is giving these arguments about how the villagers must sacrifice for the city and for the nation. He's giving these arguments in the 1950s, and the DDA is giving very similar arguments for why villagers must want to integrate with the city in 2022, except now in 2022, this is actually true. It wasn't true then. It was a fait accompli that was created, but now it is true, because these villagers are hemmed in and they don't have any civic amenities, and they have a very poor urban life, a poor quality of life, urban life. So, so yeah, this is a kind of sanctioned official genocide would be too hard a term, because there's no human beings that are being, but there are such slates of hand by which the state demolishes the rural, and even including extremely fertile. And it doesn't need to be this way. It is because some parts of the city have to be protected and other parts have to be, forces of urbanization have to be pushed into other parts and so on. It doesn't have to be this way. Yeah.
Can I add just a quick follow-on? I would also like to probably push on the point that you made about eminent domain and how rural land becomes this easier transition to establishing claims on land. I mean, at least in my research, what I'm really interested in is thinking about this shift from land to property, thinking about how, say, in unauthorized colonies, we have this whole property titling regime stepping in, willing to think about paralegal claims and thinking about various ways of how to legitimate the state's relationship to land in those contexts. And I'm just wondering, there is a lot of shift towards modern titling programs. And I'm just seeing that relationship that, maybe eminent domain doesn't need to work anymore because we are like Mukta just mentioned, now not just high-tech industry, we have high-tech property management. We're coming into an era where land to property is much more easier a shift, unlike when eminent domain was needed to wipe the slate clean and then step in and
Yes, and to create, there is a symbolic territorial capture that the state needs to show, and what better place to do it than in Delhi, because land is also, land is of course obscure. It can be as obscure, and it can be one of the most hidden forms of wealth in the modern world, of assets in the modern world, right? It can also be one of the most visible forms of power for states. And I think so it has that kind of double-edged quality. So the state is trying to, in the 1950s, it's doing these kind of really quiet encroachments in individual judicial cases with other property claimants, right? Trying to justify itself as a landowner, claim itself to be a landowner. But it is also very clear that it needs to produce a kind of almost surplus, a kind of almost embarrassing excess of land. And it does this in the 5-year plans also, right? All of the land mopping exercises in the 5-year plans, especially the 4th 5-year plan, it's an incredible document. Kriti has done some work on it. Kriti Buddhiraja, she's done amazing work on it and MPhil on it, on how the temporal and the spatial are sort of playing out on the question of land, and how mopping up land is, how producing a kind of surplus of land is so important for the Nehruvian state. And I think that, the decimation of, it's something that cannot happen with it. It cannot happen without that kind of imagination of the dissolution of the rural, at least in Delhi. I don't remember what the other thing was that I was saying, but just to respond to the comments, flatted factories are already there in the MPD 1962. But yes, the thing that you said about titling, that is really significant. You have the 2019 Regularization of Unauthorized Colonies Act, right? So the entire move now is towards titling and towards actually strengthening land claims, but they are not the full completion of bourgeois property rights. The Indian state was never able to afford a full transition to what Partha Chatterjee would have called, or many others would have called, the establishment of full bourgeois property rights. It was simply too costly for the Indian state to have freehold bourgeois property rights vested clearly in the population. But the difference between the rural and the urban is that the bourgeois property rights of the urban are established very well in practice, if not in law, whereas for the rural, they can be taken away quite easily in law. So the whole history of the abrogation, and then the reinstatement of the right to property, and then the abrogation, also the history of land acquisition, shows us how weak property rights are in the rural areas. But in the urban areas, bourgeois, while the normative liberal horizon of bourgeois property is never on the political agenda, but extant concrete urban claims on property, not land, you're right, absolutely, have always been strong. And at least to my mind, it's a large statement, I know, and maybe I should make it in a more cautious way, but to my mind, that the claims on property are wrong. And this titling is exactly because, I agree with you absolutely, because land does not need to serve its earlier purpose of sort of a kind of initial surplus accumulation. The state does not need land in that way. It has already gone through that phase. So now it's able to confer land claims, property claims, if not property rights.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to go to Manas now. Manas Murthy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. There's lots of discussions also in the middle. I had some things to say about DLF and all of that as well, but I think I have 2 points really. One is about, I think a lot of planning literature sort of talks about how planning as a form of control, or about the idea of control, or the hope of control, or the desperate need for control. But here it's sort of, you're sort of going beyond to say, well, in order to even achieve some sort of control or even hope to achieve that, there is this desperate need to achieve ownership first.
Yeah.
And that in many ways, ownership precedes control. That the only way in this kind of context, in the post-independence context, that the state, a fledgling state, can actually hope to accomplish any of the planned imaginaries is if it literally owns portions of it. And sort of that also, to me, in my mind, sort of differentiates the thing between planning and developing, because that's the difference between a DLF and a DDA at the same time, potentially, is that one is able to actually deliver something on ground, and because you kind of own that property. Just because why all of this is related, because I'm sort of researching, and thank you so much, because I was specifically wanting to look at 50s and finding almost next to nothing in terms of how DLF actually did the things that it did. And I'd really want to get in touch about that. But essentially, my question is related to my own research, which is on plotted colonies in Delhi, and why that's a very Delhi thing, and what happens at that sort of cusp of independence, with the large influx of new population, the saturation of existing urban land, as you say, and the limited control that the state has, and the limited capacity and the agency that the state has in actually developing or putting things on ground, including infrastructure. And what that has, in my mind, now it's coming up, does that have something to do with the sort of vast amounts of plotted colonies as opposed to, group housing or built houses, or provision of housing in a more concrete manner, as opposed to just saying, let's just chop up a whole bunch of land and just give it to people because we have no way of actually providing any of this. And it's for me, because I'm an architect, and my head is sort of more towards, I'm studying the builder floor. I mean, and that sort of comes at a long culmination of what's happening to planned colonies since the start of independence. And so I just your reflections on what's happening with planned colonies.
It's so Delhi, this builder floor, no? Like, yeah, and I didn't think of it like that. Actually, I don't think I'm equipped to answer your question at all. Thank you for it. I'm not equipped to answer your question. I'll venture a very small speculation, which is that because I haven't looked at, I don't have the expertise to look at what the specifics of acquisition for a plotted colonies versus, say, a group cooperating housing society might be. But I do want to say one thing, which is that, there is also, a city is also like what its movers and shakers and its elites get used to over a period of time. Even visually, right? So the LBZ, the Lutyens Bungalow Zone, right, which is a very bizarre kind of creation, because it's a garden city mixed with some kind of monumental, what Vale calls the Capitol with a COL, with the TOL, right? It's like that Capitol complex in the middle of this like very kind of mysterious foliage based, almost cantonment like garden city. Like, what is the garden city doing in the context of what should have been expensive land acquisition right next to a city that is already decaying because of congestion and density? Like, how could they come up with a plan like that? That's of course colonialism and colonial authority and their grandiosity and all of that and their ambition, and they needed to of course show that this was a great success. But what is amazing is that those densities have been protected, right? The LBZ still has stubbornly protected very, very low population densities. And what has happened over a period of time for those of us who live in the more crowded, all of us, I think, I'm assuming live in the less aesthetically spectacular and more crowded areas of Delhi and the peripheries and the fringes, and we are in NCR and Noida and Gurgaon and everything, we of course everybody starts imagining that good urban living requires a bit of a garden, a bit of a setback, right? Everybody aspires to it. Whoever can afford it will build a house in the image of the garden plot. So maybe there is something to do with that. It's a very peculiar anti-urban aesthetic right in the middle of what should have been a very densely packed city. And so maybe plotted colonies and even some of these more kind of fantastical building complexes that we are seeing in the suburbs, right, which call themselves woods and forests and all of that. Maybe there's some connection to all of that as well. I mean, there's a discomfort with saying that we live in a crowded capital city, crowded metropolis, and that discomfort has just been passed on through the kind of genetic inheritance of the elites or something, and just popularized. I don't know, just speculation. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. No, absolutely. I just wanted to add to that to say, absolutely, some of my research is also in how the aspirational, how the aspirations of the, I say middle class in quotes because nobody knows what the middle class is anymore. I mean, at least
it's an empty signifier.
Yeah. So that whoever thinks of themselves as middle class and how their aspirations kind of grew with liberalization, specifically how they are unable to kind of let go of this idea of koti and gadi, and both of those things kind of really have a lot to do with sort of the emergence of, and I just wanted to say to Mukta, I mean, that's what differentiates the builder floors from the Kolkata promoter buildings from whatever I'm coming to see now, because I looked at those and I was like, yeah, of course, this is like happening all over the place and all of that, but there is something distinctly Delhi about the imposition of parking stilts and the open arms with which people kind of like the idea of having more parking space, and what that means to the koti culture of like South Delhi neighborhoods and spaces where this was starting to happen even before there was this sort of legal instrument in 2011 which added the parking stilt, but it was happening even before that, which is kind of a signifier of how much people actually love their cars in the koti culture of Delhi. And so, yeah, it's all very interesting. I really want to stay in touch about some of the DLF stuff though. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, I mean, I've got most of my material from, but yeah, sure, we will talk.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, so Hemant said his mic is not working.
I just saw his question and I was just thinking.
Yes, do you want me? I'll just read it out. Thank you, ma'am, for giving us a deep insight about the history of master plan. I have a question about what was the impact of this rapid urbanization and its capitalist-driven government policies on the lives and livelihood, housing of urban villagers who have occupied the agriculture, I mean, who are primarily agricultural, like their primary livelihood. So yeah, about urban villages. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so depending on where in Delhi, Hemant, the village is located, the agricultural land is acquired, and then some of the common grazing land, the pasture land, whatever is declared as fallow. If you don't have standing crops on the land for more than one cycle, then that your land can be declared fallow and acquired. A very strong notion of wasteland creeps into land reform acts from the 1949 Agrarian Reforms Committee. It's kind of similar to the British idea of improvement, and how agriculturists have to adhere to very high standards of agriculture, and they have to show the land as being really, really used to its fullest capacity to prevent it from being acquired. And the flimsiest of excuses can be allowed for urban landowners to actually acquire land, including future development. So for agriculturists, if you're not currently extracting maximum value from your land and contributing to the nation, your land can be acquired. But if you're an urban landowner or a potential landowner and a land buyer, you can actually acquire land promising future development. And even then, that development, as we've seen in the case of, I mean, I'm only taking the most dramatic example, the most problematic example. But you can see in this case of Mehroli farmhouses and all could actually include, just the construction of a small shed or a water pump or something that signifies ownership. So it doesn't actually even have to be development. But your larger question is actually what happened to the villagers. And I've studied villagers not in Delhi, but I've studied villagers in Greater Noida in the NCR area. And like I said, in a response to an earlier question, it is a kind of fait accompli. Initially, there is a lot of protest and there's a lot of loss of livelihood. And then eventually, over a period of time, the successive generations lose interest in agriculture because it becomes almost impossible with all the conditions and so on. This is all apart from general problems in Indian agriculture, like fragmentation of land holdings and all that. You have this kind of urban pressure coming. You have a severe deterioration of collective life and community life, and this is also going. It's very ironic because so many of the planning documents are talking about the normative villager, right? The ideal villager, the one who goes to the library in the evening and goes to farm in the morning and so on, except the common facilities and community infrastructure that is required to produce any kind of community life is actually deteriorated so fast. And the Delhi Land Reforms Act, and then from there to the NPD in 1962 is happening in the context of this great national program of rural development, right? The community projects, the pilot project and so on. But that's all on paper. Actually, yeah, the land acquisition more or less destroys village economy. Some classes of farmers, of course, do very well. They do very well because of land acquisition, but that's also a later development. Most of the land that was acquired in the Delhi villages, the 500 odd villages, received very poor compensation. And so these villages gradually become urbanized. There are transitional occupations like milk supply and transport, also security, which is a euphemism for becoming henchmen for local politicians. Getting into local politics is also a profession, but eventually there is a kind of a collapse of rural life. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I've seen these more in the Greater Noida NCR area.
Okay. Any more questions? I don't see any more people raising their hands. But I mean, you do you want to go back to your last slide and just sort of talk a little bit about your, final summing up points? Like, I think I cut you off.
No, that's okay. That's perfectly fine. I could have gone on, but I just wanted to end with some sort of some just thoughts on what this kind of state and private capital contest in land actually, whether this confirms, because I started with Anish Vinayak's thesis about how the property market ingested the state. Sorry, the state ingested the property market. And I'm wondering if it is the other way around, that the property market, and I mean, I think maybe just to end with some kind of thoughts on what we actually think the state is, right? And there is a very famous article by Philip Evans, and then also Timothy Mitchell has very nice kind of, builds on that very nicely, which is that there's this very nice formulation I like that, and I see this really when I'm looking at the early Indian parliament, which is that the state is a kind of line drawn between, inside society. It is a line of normative behaviors of a particular kind that is really drawn within society. And you see this absolute porousness of the early Indian state, where property interests are making their way into the parliament in one way or another, and allowing some really, really remarkably pro-private urban property ownership bills to be actually passed. But while it is doing that, while the state is getting embroiled, and while the property market is ingesting the state also needs to produce symbolically the idea of sovereign territory, not just in Delhi, but for the nation as a whole. It also needs to demonstrate the success of land reform. It also needs to say that it is the authoritative, preeminent, jurisdiction within this territory. So, and as I don't know who it was, Manas or somebody who said recently, it also needs to actually acquire physical property, which was one of the ways that it was why it was so invested in rural property. So all of these have to be done together. So which one is ingesting? I mean, I tend to think of, yeah, I tend to
You're
think,
actually doing a prehistory. Sorry, I'm just gonna.
no, I'm done. Yeah,
I'm gonna wrap up, Mukhtar.
Yeah,
Last moment.
yeah.
But like, you're doing a prehistory of the moment of like the moment that Emma Tarlow was talking about in emergency, where sterilization certificates are being given out to avoid slum evictions, but the evictions happen anyway, and Trilok Puri and all those areas which were former refugee colonies. So these are technically still refugee colonies, and yet not, because they're not technically refugee colonies. They're on the borders of refugee colonies, which are and the rhetoric of all of that is population control and sterilization drives and slum eviction drives and cleanliness and all of that, and the fact that all of that happens in 1975, so 3 decades later, and you see the logic of state acquisition really coming to fruition over like coercion and bodies and all of that she found. So you're doing like this almost a prehistory of this moment too, of the moment of 1975 and Turkmen Gate, and like all those moments that you're talking about, you find physical manifestation of that coercion in these segregations, these points of friction, like why Turkmen Gate, why Trilok Puri. And then you see, of course, because the map was already there, the existing registers were building up.
Yeah.
I mean,
I do follow the story actually, and Turkmen Gate is it's a flashpoint because it also signals it's at that point between Old Delhi and New Delhi.
Yeah.
And that point has been a source of obsession for planners for generations.
Yeah.
And there have been proposals, as you know, with Good Friend and all recording this, right? Saying that should be made into a kind of almost like a zone of peace between the two cities.
Yeah.
So there's much, there's kind of remarkable violence in the plans as well.
Yeah, you try to museumize it, you try to erase it, you try to do everything except let it live. Anyway,
right.
So we can really just go on. So thank you so much for this really great
pleasure.
Session. Thank you so much. I hope you got something out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the questions, everybody, and for organizing this.
All right. Okay. So Mukta, should we just leave?
No, we just thank everyone and leave, and see you next month. We'll be sending out the mailer to everyone, and we'll have another great talk lined up. Thanks, Sunalini, for today.
Thank you, Mukta and Aprajita. Thanks.
See you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.